In the early 1980s, video games were at a crossroads. Racing titles were fast but shallow, and consoles struggled to capture the thrill of the arcade. But then, Nintendo tried something different. A game so simple it could be explained in seconds, yet so brutal it demanded hours of mastery. Why did this unassuming dirt bike racer become one of the most iconic NES launch titles? What made players in 1985 obsess over overheating engines, precise landings, and high-speed crashes on a little gray box? And most importantly, what did Nintendo learn from this modest experiment that will go on to shape some of the biggest franchises in gaming history? This is not just the story of a motocross game, it's the story of how Nintendo found its voice in racing, a voice that would echo through F-Zero, Mario Kart, and beyond. This is the story of Excitebike. Now, around 1983 and 1984, arcades were at the center of gaming culture. Titles like Pole Position defined what racing games were supposed to look like and feel like. But while Namco specialized in F1 racing cars, Nintendo had a different vision. They wanted speed and competition to fit inside your living room. And that vision became Excitebike, a dirt track racer that launched on the Famicom system in Japan in 1984. And unlike sleek arcade racers of the day, Excitebike was stripped down to the bare essentials. So it just wasn't about graphics or gimmicks, it was about rhythm, jumps, and the tension of balancing turbo boost before your engine overheated. But Nintendo didn't stop there. In fact, before many players in the West ever touched Excitebike on the NES, there was another version, Versus Excitebike. And this was the arcade edition, built for Nintendo's Versus system cabinets that were in circulation at the time, which placed home console software into arcade hardware. Now, at first look, there wasn't much of a difference as far as cosmetics, but the game would turn out to be a little different. The difficulty was supposedly turned up and the tracks were more extensive. And along with the CPU racers being more aggressive, the later tracks would definitely keep you pumping in quarters. So where the NES home release encouraged long mastery at home, Versus Excitebike was all about instant challenge and fast, brutal races. Now for me personally, I have to say that I didn't see Versus Excitebike until after I played the home version. I played the home version first, and then I would see it in arcade. And I remember trying it in the arcade, and the game was a little, to me, some of the things that were different in the arcade version was, and just going back playing it recently, I can actually reattest to this, was the fact that as far as skill level, I think the skill level to me seemed to be pretty much the same. The only major differences was the end tracks got a little bit harder, and they did have more, I'd say, I won't call them cutscenes, but I'd say more animations, and the characters looked a little different. At the end, when you jump on the block after you win a race, at home it's only you in the second place and the third place box. In arcade, there's actually 5 boxes that the winners stand on in the winner's circle, if you will. And on top of that, they did have a bonus stage as well, which didn't make it to the home version. Other than that though, as far as music and stuff like that, it did have a couple of tracks in the arcade that were a little different from the home version. But outside of that, I don't feel like there was much of a major difference as far as gameplay. But like I said, I played Versus Excitebike after the fact. So at the time when I played Excitebike in arcade, I was actually pretty good at the home version. So the translation from home version to arcade was actually pretty accurate. And I was actually just tapped myself on the shoulder. I was actually pretty good in arcade as well. So, but for the most part, they're pretty much the same game with a few minor differences. But we will see a version of Excitebike that is way different from the home version, which is actually a home version itself. More on that later. So by 1983, Nintendo had just launched the Famicom in Japan, but they were still experimenting, still figuring out what kinds of games could define their new home console. And unlike arcades, which thrived on spectacle and specialized controls, the Famicom had to do with 2 buttons and a simple D-pad. So designers Torishima Izumi and Shigeru Miyamoto knew they couldn't match the graphics of the arcade machines. They had to create something that leaned into Nintendo's strengths, simplicity, rhythm, and addictive replayability. So the development team approached Excitebike almost like a puzzle. How could you capture the thrill of motocross racing, muddy tracks, gravity-defying jumps, the roar of the crowd, and nothing more than 8-bit graphics and a handful of sound effects? Their solution was elegant. Instead of realism, they leaned into the feel of the game. And with that, the ramps became the star of the show. The game's physics, tilting the bike mid-air, landing perfectly, and managing your momentum gave players the illusion of real motocross dynamics, even without the detailed visuals. So overall, the challenge was simple, but kind of intoxicating in a way. Stay in rhythm, master your jumps, and don't overheat that fragile engine. So let's talk about the gameplay. Now at first glance, Excitebike looks pretty simple. You race from left to right, dodging obstacles, managing the ramps, and beating the clock. But beneath that simplicity is a game of balance and a dance between speed, risk, and control. So you had the heart of the experience being the turbo button. You press it and you fly across the dirt at blistering speed. But abuse it and your engine will betray you and overheat. forcing you to watch helplessly as your rider slowed to a crawl and just stopped. And it was kind of punishing and actually kind of hurt a lot if you're racing at the higher levels. And with this being so simplistic of a feature, it made a big deal and actually played a big role in the game. I mean, it made you kind of do, at the time, even in 1984, 1985 timeframe, kind of make that decision of risk versus reward. Do I want to keep speeding through and get a little bit more air on those jumps? Or do I want to take the safer route and just kind of use the turbo sparingly and wait for those cool-off zones? So, I mean, that was a big deal because when you hit the turbo, you jump faster. You could actually outrun enemies sometimes to a point. I mean, that blue guy would keep up with you, but we'll talk about that guy in a minute. I mean, he was probably the crux of the game that was your nemesis and made the game difficult. So then came the ramps, and each one was a test of timing and nerve. If you tilt your bike too far forward going over the ramps, you might slam head first into the dirt. Lean back too far and you flip over like a rag doll. But if you land it just right, you'll act like nothing ever happened, like you never even hit a ramp. And those speed bursts help out a lot in this game. I mean, even to this day, if I play Excitebike, it's always satisfying to come off a ramp and get that perfect landing. I mean, old as the game is, it's still, because it's not, you don't get it all the time unless you've mastered this game, and every time you come off a ramp, you're going to land perfectly. But that's actually, to me anyway, still a satisfying feeling. And that blue biker, we have to talk about him real quick. I always called him Pierre. Don't ask me why. I always called that cat Pierre when he drove around. The other guys didn't have names, but he did. And he was cheap in this game. But he had to be. He had to have the rubber band mechanics where you couldn't outrun him. You could kind of speed past him a little, but he always go neck and neck with you. And that was good because one of the strategies was to clip the front wheels of the other biker with your back wheel and you send them flying. So you could do that with him, and even if you left him, you still really could. If you hit a high ramp, his speed, he was so fast that he'd keep up with you. Even if you're flying through the air at a high jump, he'd still keep up with you. So, and his jump arc was ridiculous. He'd hit the smallest of ramps and then he'd fly like he hit that the main ramp you hit like this that makes you fly. He just hit small ones there. So he was kind of a catch-all. Whenever he felt like doing, I'd say he wasn't as bad as that yellow car in RC Pro-Am. He wasn't that bad, but he did have moments where he'd, just start tripping. So yeah, you had to watch that guy, but you had to have some type of rival in the game. So I think for what it was, Pierre, you did good. Now for kids of the mid 80s, these weren't just mechanics. They were actually personal challenges. Being the track meant conquering yourself, proving that you had the patience to master precision in a game that looked deceptively easy, but punished every mistake. And then there was the traffic. Other riders, they weren't just background, they were moving hazards. You cut them off, clip the back tire, or land wrong and you'd wipe out in a spectacular crash, losing precious seconds. And in this game, every second counts. Also, for a game built on 8-bit sprites, Excitebike managed to create chaos, tension, and high-stakes drama at times, especially if you're running behind on a track. And I had to say with this game, this is what made Excitebike to me different from other arcade racers. The mechanics. Like if you play games like, we'll just say Pole Position, for example. I mean, you could curve a little bit and, the race, and you could hit other cars, you could actually crash, stuff like that. I mean, it was typical racing. A good game, don't get me wrong, Pole Position was awesome. But, it was pretty straightforward. Excitebike was cool because it played on the mechanics of a bike, of an actual bike. I'm not a bike rider like that, but if you ever go in the air and you try to manage, it was kind of cartoony. You can't do that in real life, but not like to that extent like they do it. But it gave you that feel of feeling the game, I guess. When you push forward, you come forward, and when you hit the ground, you actually had to hit it just right. So it actually had a mechanic system that you actually had to master to actually get good times on these tracks, or even cut your time down, or even if you're speed running this game or whatever, trying to get the lowest time. Also, the other bikers, while they didn't have names or anything like that, they were still cool because they added a level of chaos on the screen. So if you ever played Excitebike before, you give you that first custom track with no bikers, it's a night and day difference between running the track clean with no bikers and having them on there. So with only being 3 of them and the sprites being so limited, this was a huge achievement in my mind for Excitebike. There's no other way to play it unless the other races are there, in my opinion. So they definitely made the game come to life. And Nintendo's genius is their simplicity. You had one button for acceleration, one for turbo, and that's it. That simple. And what's cool about it, the game was so accessible for new players, but it was just complex enough to hide layers of strategy beneath it. It was a playground for skill and discipline disguised as a dirt track. And again, I think this is where a lot of people underestimate Excitebike. It wasn't just a racing game, okay? It was one of the first console titles to actually introduce real risk management mechanics. And like we talked about earlier, that idea of forcing players to choose between safe and risky strategies with the engine overheating, that later became a cornerstone of modern game design, not just in racing. Let's not get it twisted. Not just in racing, but in genres across the board. So unlike most games of its era, Excitebike didn't try to tell a story through cutscenes or text. There were no heroes to save, no princes to rescue, no evil empire to defeat. Instead, its story was written through the dirt, the ramps, and the crashes. And it was a big narrative of skill and struggle. And the victories didn't feel scripted. I mean, because sometimes you could run a perfect race and you're just playing out of your mind. And other times it's a track that doesn't really give you trouble, but the bikers will make it hard and you just wipe out on the track and actually lose the game. So yeah, it was no guarantees. I'd say after level 3, no guarantees after track 3. But that's not all. Where Excitebike truly broke ground, and this was huge back in the day, it's very impressive, was its design mode. So for the first time on a home console, players could build their own worlds. Well, we won't call them worlds, we'll say tracks at least, but worlds if you will. I mean, you could place a ramp here, a mud pit there, and a brutal gauntlet of obstacles your friends just had to conquer. So now it wasn't just racing anymore. It was actually authorship. Instead of just being a writer in the game, you were actually a creator, crafting challenges, frustrations, and triumphs for others to experience. Or it was cool if you wanted to just make your own fun tracks just to see what you could do in the game. So it was actually pretty cool. Now, think about what this meant in 1985. At a time where video games were thought as passive entertainment, Excitebike handed the keys to the players and invited them to become actual designers long before modding or sandbox gaming became part of the culture, like it is today anyway. Now, there was a catch. The NES couldn't save these custom tracks. You had to rebuild them every time you powered the system back on, and maybe that was part of the magic. I mean, each new session was a clean slate, a chance to reimagine or to reinvent. And for kids of the 80s, this wasn't just gameplay, it was storytelling through creation, long before Minecraft, Little Big Planet turned into a movement. And I gotta talk about that real quick. I mean, that was super impressive. I mean, to have, because obviously Excitebike didn't have a battery backup or anything, so it couldn't save the tracks. Battery backup wouldn't come till later on with Legend of Zelda, I think. But at the same time, the fact that you could create, it would actually write your program kind of in a way to the game, or at least what you want as far as making the designs and making the track the way you wanted to make it. And that was a big deal. I mean, this is before Mario Maker. I mean, we take it for granted now. Mario Maker, games like that, where you just design your own stuff. Back then, 1985, that was kind of unheard of. I mean, it was very few, if I can't even really think offhand, any more games that let you do that. I'm sure they're out there for the NES library, just nothing comes to mind right now. But if I think about track design, Excitebike jumps in my mind first. So that was kind of a really big deal. And it was, for the NES, for a console version, because the arcade version didn't have that. So kudos to Nintendo for 1985 with your own personal level design. Let's talk about the legacy it left behind. On October 18, 1985, the day the Nintendo Entertainment System officially launched in North America, packed inside the lineup of 18 launch titles was the unassuming little game, Excitebike. And I gotta be honest with you, it wasn't the first thing people thought about when buying the NES. Most eyes went straight to Super Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt. But for kids who slipped Excitebike into that great console, the effect and the experience was unforgettable. So reviews at the time praised its speed and innovation, and game critics admired the track editor even if some dismissed it as a novelty. But players knew the truth, this was something special. It was a game that wasn't just about winning, it was about mastery. And every crash felt personal and every victory earned through precision. So while we're here, I want to talk about the ultimate, in my mind, as far as 8-bit NES Excitebike goes, was the Excitebike Versus that came out for the Super Famicom in 1988. And this one, a lot of people never played this one before. Maybe they did re-release it in the States with the Wii U Virtual Console, I believe, had it. I didn't get it for that one. I didn't play this one until later on. But I think the Wii U Virtual Console had it. I think you can get it on the Switch now. But Versus Excitebike anyway, basically came out in 1988 for the Famicom system. And this thing is probably the coolest one you can get in 8-bit form. I mean, it had, not only did it have all the tracks and the stuff that the original had, it actually had new music, new tracks, and we'll take a quick look at it real quick while I'm talking about it. But it had new tracks, it had, in my opinion, it basically blended the arcade and the home version together and gave you this great version here. For starters, you actually had music now when you're going through the tracks, and the music is actually pretty catchy. You had brand new music at the start screen when the races would start at the beginning. That was pretty awesome. And you had pretty good sprites at the end. You had actually, when you won and lost, you actually had more than the guy just jumping up and down. They actually looked more like the arcade versions of them. And when you lost, you'd put your head down and, you kick this rock or whatever he's kicking or whatever. So that was a cool touch there. They also brought the bonus stage over from the arcade into the home version, which is actually pretty cool. So if you didn't play the arcade, then you wouldn't have known about this stage here. And it's not a whole lot by today's standards. You just jump over some crates. But at the time, it was a big deal to have a bonus stage, especially if you've never seen it before on Excitebike. And probably one of the best things of all, this game, this one actually had versus mode. Put the versus in versus. You could play with 2 people simultaneously, and the movement was smooth. And if you see me here, now I'm pitiful, I don't have anybody to play with, but at the bottom you can see that it actually had split screen, and there was no slowdown when you're playing on the screen, so you could actually go side by side and race head to head on different tracks. And this was awesome. I mean, I was impressed by this game. Even to this day, I was impressed by what they did in 1988. This was the definitive way to play Excitebike. And to top it off, they even had the editor mode in this version to actually make your own tracks. And if we compare the editor modes from the NES American version compared to the Japanese version, night and day difference, as you can see here. Now, granted, to be fair, this game did have a few more years of bake in the oven as opposed to the 1985 release we would get, but even still, for 8-bit gaming, this was huge. So if you're a fan of legit 8-bit old school Excitebike, this is definitely the version to play. So looking back, Excitebike might seem like just another simple 8-bit racer, but its legacy is far larger than its small cartridge suggests. What Nintendo built in 1984 didn't end with the NES, it rippled outward, shaping their entire approach to racing games. And years after 1985, fans hoped for a sequel, and that dream finally arrived in 2000 with Excitebike 64 on the N64. Now, this wasn't just an update, this was a bold reimagining with full 3D graphics, tricks, and realistic dirt bike physics, and it became a cult classic. And hidden inside this beautiful game, a loving nod to the past, the original NES version was tucked away as an unlockable mode, reminding players where it all began. And I gotta be honest with you guys, this one is a fun one. If you've never played it before, N64, if you've never played Excitebike 64, you need to go back and play it, because this is a really fun game. The voices were on point in here, the music was cool. I'll just show you a quick little sample of the game. But it's actually, and one thing I will say, this game is hard though. I mean, when somebody's in first place, you have to earn a victory in this game. But what was cool about it, it had multiple different players. So you had like all the bike riders, each one had their own strengths and weaknesses. You can pick between the characters. You can actually change their colors in it. They actually had codes in it where you had invincibility mode and all other kind of features. You actually put codes in this game. And it actually sounded good when they talked. The mechanics were pretty good on the game, and the graphics were amazing for the time. So I think a lot of people slept on this game at the beginning, but overall, over time, this game did become pretty popular. And definitely, if you never played this one, go back and give it a play. It is an awesome game. But even with that, Excitebike's legacy stretches beyond its own franchise. Its ideas bled into Nintendo's greatest racing innovations. The balance of risk and reward, you see that in games like F-Zero and multiplayer chaos perfected in Mario Kart, and even the emphasis on player creativity through track errors and customizations that would echo decades later in games like Super Mario Maker. And then came the ultimate tribute. In Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Nintendo built the Excitebike Arena, and every race there is randomized, every set of ramps and jumps reshuffled, just like the childhood rearranging obstacles in the NES track editor. And that was a nice touch, Easter egg, and love letter. It wasn't just fan service, it was Nintendo acknowledging that Excitebike is the bedrock of their racing lineage. But perhaps its greatest legacy is less obvious. Excitebike taught players that racing games could be more than just flashy graphics. They could actually be skill-based competitions where every choice you made in the game mattered. And that philosophy, accessible on the surface but endlessly deep, remains at the heart of Nintendo's best hits. Even today, you can still feel Excitebike's spirit every time you balance risk and reward in a turbo boost, every time you face the chaos of multiplayer competition, or every time you create a track or course of your own. It all traces back to a humble dirt bike game from 1984. So what I think about Excitebike? Excitebike was just, it was a really fun game. I remember spending hours on that game playing it. It was just, at the time, I mean, they had other races. I remember I had like motocross for the old computer system. I remember playing that game, and those were fun games. And one of the main things being with that game, the mechanics and the physics in it, because at the time, for me anyway, most motocross, I mean, they had the games like, if you want to count hang on and stuff like that, that was cool in the arcade with the bike handle and everything. But at home, you just couldn't do that, at least not yet. And Excitebike captured that essence. I think they did a good enough job to where you actually felt like you were on a bike. And then the mechanics were real simple. I think I appreciate it a lot because the level of entry was so small. I mean, you could pick it up and start playing it. And then once you got to the higher levels, I'd say the last level, the level before that being the hardest because it's long and a few mistakes, you're not going to finish in time. So it was timed, there was pressure in the game. And then you had the addition of the other bikers in the game. I mean, it just brought the game to life because you could have had just a straight up game with, you know, especially back in 1985, a game with no other competitors, just you run across the tracks, and it still would have been fun. But the fact that they took that extra mile to put those characters in there to give you kind of like to give it a more serious and realistic feel and put higher stakes in the game, I feel like that was a nice touch there. Also, the overheating mechanic, as small as it is, it kind of makes you have to be tactful how you navigate the tracks if you want to burn that turbo to get a higher arc jump when you go over a ramp. And the ramps, let's talk about just a simplistic thing with the ramps. They were all different and they all had different mechanics when you hit the ramp. So the big hills would kind of go if you kept your finger on the turbo button. If you had a bunch of those big hills, you can just kind of automatically go on them. You had that little small one that gave you that high jump arc. I mean, that was probably the funnest one to be on. You had those little small ones that you'd pull back on the bike to kind of navigate when you go over them. I mean, this is the design of the ramps and where you put them actually played a role in how hard the course could be. So that was ingenious how they made all those ramps work together to flow on the track. So Excitebike, and I think a lot of people don't see that. I think a lot of people do in some ways. I'm not gonna say a lot of people don't, but I feel like if you're not paying attention, you'll miss that small design that was baked into the love they made when they made this game. I mean, that's a big accomplishment, and I have to think that a lot of thought went into that when they made this game. So Excitebike was just cool. And then you had the ultimate version of Excitebike, the versus one for the Famicom, and that one is just it's just so much going on in that game, that not a lot, but the fact that you had true verses in that one, the fact that they improved the graphics with the cutscenes at the end, they actually had music when you race across the tracks, and they actually had the bonus stage. So yeah, I mean, I would have loved to get that complete game back in the day, but we would get to play it later on a virtual Wii U console, or virtual Wii console, I believe it was. And I think it was for the Switch. I didn't play it for the Switch, but I think the Switch you can play it as well. So if you haven't played the true versus that came out in 1988, definitely get one shot. As a matter of fact, I do remember a buddy of mine. So just to give you a feel of how popular Excitebike was back in the day. So this is probably around 1993 timeframe. We had just graduated. Now I already had my job. So I was driving my buddy to a job interview because he was going to try to get a job. So I drive him there, we stop, he gets out, he goes in, comes back, and I say, hey, did you get the job? And what he did was just iconic at the time. He was like, that noise you make at the end, that music at the end when you finish the track, and he jumped up and down like that. I thought that was hilarious. And it still sticks in my mind to this day, just the love of a game and just how, you know, when you're kids back in the 80s, when you're playing those games, just how things still stick in your mind, and you kind of some ways apply those to real life. So I thought that was pretty cool. I thought I'd share that with you guys. But yeah, so yeah, Excitebike definitely had some influence, especially if you played it back in the day in 1985. So that's gonna do it with Excitebike, guys. This is a very fun one to play, very easy entry level. Let me know your experience with Excitebike in the comments below. And with that, guys, as always, take care of yourself, protect your inner peace. God bless you. We'll catch you next video. Thanks for watching.